Welcome back to Beauty Marks Podcast, a space where we embrace marks acquired through our journey. My name is Elizabeth Savillon, and thank you for joining me on episode 44 of this podcast. Just a disclaimer before we get started, I want to have a trigger warning, just letting you know we will be talking about sexual assault, what it means if you have been someone that has been affected by sexual assault. You might know someone that has been affected by that. And so we're going to be talking a very informative conversation. This is a very educational conversation that needs to be had. And this is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So I thought that why not now to have this conversation? It is uncomfortable for some people. So I definitely want to let you know we will go into some details about what the process is, how it affects someone that has been sexually assaulted, mentally, physically, in relationships, and then how you can also help. It's a great conversation, and I hope that if you made it to here, you tune in, and because it is something that I am very much an advocate to help people that have been through sexual assault and find this topic important. So Emilie Mitchell is an education coordinator of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, and she will be sharing and informing us on how you can be an advocate and help for change and just help those around you and yourself if you have been someone that has been sexually assaulted. And so I hope you stay tuned. So let's just get right into it. Welcome to Beauty Marks Podcast.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm so excited to be here today and to be a guest instead of...
I know she has her own podcast, so you definitely have to go check that out. That's VSC, right?
Mm-hmm.
Podcast. And
Yes.
what do you guys talk about over there?
We talk about so many different things. Essentially, the VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential services to survivors of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. So whether that is a sexual assault, whether that is a violent crime, any kind of trauma, anything that can be linked back to an event, basically, and someone's just having a harder time processing it. And we'll talk a little bit about what that can look like. But essentially, the podcast is essentially there to talk about so many different topics, such as we were just talking about toxic positivity before we started recording, but other things too, like self-care, dual victimization, vicarious trauma, just in an effort to kind of normalize conversations about violence so that we can help prevent them.
That's really good. Emily, what are you passionate about? And can you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm super passionate about violence prevention education. So I actually got my undergraduate degree at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana. And there I was getting my psych degree. And for every first year student on campus, you have to take a 2-hour seminar about first year campus acquaintance rape education, or FICARE. And I took it and I learned some things about it, but later on you could actually become a FICARE facilitator because it's actually facilitated by students.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend actually asked me, like, hey, I'm going to be taking this class. Do you want to take it with me to become a facilitator? And I said, okay, sure. And my eyes were just open to things like rape culture, victim blaming. I mean, when I was a freshman in college, I honestly did not really know much about sexism. I actually didn't even think it was a thing really in modern day. But wow, was I wrong? I didn't know anything about like racism at all. And so that class really fueled my passion. And from there, I became that FICARE facilitator for a couple of years. And that's really where my passion is. I had no idea that sexual assault was even such an issue that affects everyone. And from there, I'd love to be part of that change, part of that process of kind of that eye-opening, hard look at our culture, what we can do to help prevent it.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure when you bring information to people, in the community and places, everyone probably has that shock of like, wait, that happens like here, that happens around us. Like you're saying,
Yes.
like Really? I felt like that when I was at UCF, when there would always like when I would always hear like that happens all the time that people would get
Mhm,
either molested or raped on campus. And
mhm.
when I started getting the warnings, like the messages, because when I was a
Yes,
student, I was shocked. I'm like, this happens like every day. Like this
yes.
happened like more common than what I thought. So it is something that we definitely need to talk more about. And I know it is a sensitive topic. So before this episode goes, I'm going to definitely let people know that if maybe you have experienced that, or,
Mhm.
it's a very sensitive topic to talk about, but it does need to be brought up. So, can you share a little bit more about what Victim Services does before we talk about the stats and just get more into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned, the VSC is that nonprofit organization that provides free confidential services. And those services are can look a variety of different ways. So, first off, I want to say, it doesn't matter what the trauma is. So, 90% of the people that we work with are sexual assault survivors, but it could be any kind of trauma. And it actually doesn't matter when the trauma occurred. It could have happened today, could have happened years and years ago. And trauma can be something that could stick with someone for a while. So we're really fortunate that the VSC is able to provide those services no matter when the trauma occurred. And these services are for anyone within the Central Florida community, but we would never turn anyone away. We'd always be
Mhm.
able to, connect them with people outside as well. But essentially, these services are for individuals 12 and older, and they can look a variety of different ways. So the first one is the 24-hour helpline, which is 407 500 HEAL, HEAL. It truly is 24 hours. They will be connected by a live person, one of our
Mhm.
amazing master's level victim advocates who are all trauma informed, who are there on the other line. So if someone's feeling overwhelmed, if someone is going through a crisis at that
Mhm.
moment and needs someone to talk to, needs someone to help ground them, I should say, that's what that victim advocate is there for. Also, that victim advocate can accompany them to court. They can help them apply for victims compensation. They can help them, and they can actually accompany them to the forensic exam, which is one of our other services I wanted to talk about. So if someone was gone through a sexual assault and would like to have that DNA evidence collected, whether or not they want to report in that moment, but they just want that option, they can call our 24-hour helpline and be connected with our advocate and actually go to one of our confidential forensic exam locations. We're pretty lucky here in Central Florida because a lot of these rape kits or forensic exams are done in a hospital setting, which
Mhm.
isn't the best way to start a healing journey, in a
Mhm.
waiting room, all those things. And so we are able to have that one-on-one kind of care. And one of our certified SANE nurses will come, or sexual assault nurse examiners will come and take that DNA evidence and store it. Whether or not they want to report, the survivor can decide later on.
Mm.
And essentially, that has to happen within 5 days or 120 hours of the assault occurring, just so that they can get the DNA evidence. And those nurses are actually, they go through a separate certification process because it is such a sensitive, uh,
Mhm.
process. And then another service I want to highlight is, later on, maybe a survivor of trauma has is in a more stable time and is looking to have a deeper dive or wants to process the trauma even further, then they can be referred to our therapy department. So we have licensed contract therapists that are all trauma informed as well, do specific therapy for trauma. And we also do have support groups too,
Mhm.
such as a Black survivors of intimate partner violence. We have a men's group, a women's group. We have a mixed gender. We even have a Spanish speaking group and an LGBTQ plus survivor group. We also do some group therapies. Like, for example, we even have right now, we have our Passion Flower Project. So we have this little garden outside where survivors come and do some garden therapy, and they just talk about their experiences and then relate it back to the garden. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
really cool support groups and things going on as well. And these services are absolutely free. and they're for people who have gone through the trauma themselves and also their supporters too. So,
Yeah.
they go through vicarious trauma is what we call it,
Mhm.
or secondary trauma. So those are just some of the services. And the last one, of course, is the education and outreach, which is my job. So I'm the education coordinator at the VSC. So I go out and I host conversations about healthy relationships, sexual assault awareness, sexual harassment. I talk about things like stalking, just in an effort to prevent violence by normalizing these conversations and getting our services out there for who needs it.
Yeah. Well, I want to touch base on what you said about that you also help with the victim's family or maybe friends that also, because when trauma occurs, I have understood that it affects multiple people in different ways. So, like
Mhm.
if the victim experiences trauma, it also affects, the parents, maybe the siblings, maybe the relationship in all different aspects. So, it's great that you guys support even other people that have been affected as well. And all the services that you guys provide is amazing because I feel like that all just makes it, even though it's such a hard, tough topic and issue that that victim has experienced, having that support and just having all those different avenues, just makes it a little bit lighter, I would say, or
Yeah.
easier to maneuver through with people that have gone through it and all of that. So can we go into the stats of sexual assault, because you said something that the victim gets to decide if they, report it or not. So that means that some of
Right.
them are reported, some of them are not, when it comes to
Right.
that. And on rain.org, you shared with me some stats that some of the people that are sexually assaulted are by people that they either know or around them, so those are pretty alarming, but we have experience in all different types of cultures, societies, that does happen, that things happen and then they're not talked about within the family, they're not reported. So can you go into a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So with statistics, it's always hard to talk about it in the sense that it's hard to know, since sexual assault is one of the most underreported and under convicted crimes, actually. And so when we look at things like statistics, we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt because, as you
Mm,
mentioned, it is severely underreported. And so, yeah, a lot of the stats that we look at is from Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, which is rain.org. Wonderful resource for anyone who's listening. Definitely check them out. And they basically compile a lot of different sources because, stats can be different,
mhm,
depending. But what we know from, at least from rain, is that, 3 out of every 4 sexual assaults are not reported. And with that, we have to take the stats with a grain of salt. But I do want to just kind of highlight a few different things. So we also have that every 73 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. Once again, that's just reported numbers. That's just what we
mhm,
know. So it could be happening a lot more. I also like to point out on Rain's website that out of 1,000 rapes, 995 perpetrators go free. So that is
mhm,
the staggering statistic of how unconvicted it is as well. And I want to highlight some other stats too. We know that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men will be victims of rape in their lifetime, but that's just looking at them as adults. So actually, if we take into account childhood sexual abuse, which is sexual violence that happens when people are 18 and younger, so it's actually 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 men overall throughout their whole life. So if anyone has time, I would also check out oneinsix.org, which looks at those statistics for men specifically, just to highlight that this is an issue just for women. And going off of that, that's just looking at binary sex, right? So actually, trans. We don't have a lot of information on the LGBTQ plus community in general, but we do know from one research study that 1 in 2 individuals that identify as trans will actually be victims of sexual violence in their lifetime as well. We don't have any information on non-binary, at least any that I can find. And so essentially, this is a really rampant issue. It's an issue that we definitely need to talk about, like you said, Elizabeth, because it's happening a lot more than I think a lot of people realize. And it could be happening even more than we know because this is just reported numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very like how you said, those are all things that we know, but there could be a lot more. What are some misconceptions? Because you said there that, it happens to men too. There's
Mhm.
sometimes like a misconception that it only happens to women. And I've seen a lot of campaigns when it comes to women and assault. So
Yeah.
first, actually, when you were talking about sexual assault, maybe someone doesn't know exactly what would be under the category of sexual assault. So
Mhm.
can you break that down a little bit and then go into the misconceptions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, sexual assault, the legal definition is different depending on what state you live in. The definition that I use is sexual assault is any type of forced or coerced sexual contact that happens without consent. And consent has to look a few different ways. Of course, it has to be continual. It doesn't have matter kind of has to happen every single time, I suppose. So essentially, it doesn't matter the relationship that the person has with the other person. You could be married for 50 years, you could be married for, 10 years or dating for a week. The consent has to happen every single time sexual activity is going to occur. It has to be an enthusiastic yes, not an absence of a no. There should be no coercion going on. Those kinds of things. You can't give consent if you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. If you, everyone has to be sober, everyone has to be on the same page, has to be fully informed. There should be no surprises as things change within the activity too. People should be communicating that. It should be like a conversation. So that is the definition that I like to share. And sexual violence does have an umbrella under it, and under it includes sexual assaults, but it also can include molestation. It could include childhood sexual abuse, sexual harassment, that kind of thing too. So that's a great question. As far as there are a lot of different misconceptions when it comes to sexual assault, and then the one that I already kind of highlighted was that there's this idea that it only happens to women. Absolutely not. It happens to men as well. And it also happens to non binary individuals. It does not discriminate based on gender whatsoever. There's also a misconception, like I mentioned, that it can't happen within intimate partner relationships. Now that we kind of understand what consent needs to be, which is no matter the relationship, we can see that absolutely it can happen in and without intimate partner relations. And the reason I bring that up is because there was a long time where people thought that if you were married, that rape cannot happen in the
Mm.
relationship. Absolutely false. There's another one that I like to highlight too, that there's this idea that victims or survivors of sexual assault will be hysterical or crying, or there's only one way to react to trauma. While that could be the case, that a survivor can feel could be in that kind of state, that's not how everyone reacts. Everyone reacts to trauma differently, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's also, this misconception and victim blaming in general, which is just putting blame on the victim instead of on the perpetrator where it belongs. But there's this misconception that it's up to kind of us to protect ourselves from rape instead of
Mm.
teaching others to not abuse or to hold abusers accountable. So I think that idea is just kind of victim blaming in itself, like there's any actions that we can do that can protect us in that sense, or it's up to us, which never ever the victim's fault. I will say that until I'm blue in the face, to be honest, because there's nothing that you can say, nothing that you can wear, nothing that you can do that will ask for sexual assault, right? That's just not how it works. There's also this misconception that people lie about being sexually assaulted, which we know from research that it's only 2 to 8%, which is actually the same amount as other felonies. So
Mm.
people are actually just as likely to be falsely accused for murder as they are for sexual assaults. So that misconception definitely needs to be broken down there. We should start by believing whenever a survivor tells us we should believe that they experience this. We're in no position to,
Mhm.
that's not our job in that moment. There's also a misconception that rape is actually about sex, and actually it's really more about power and control. It's one person exerting their power over someone else. And then the other ones that I like to mention is that there's this idea, and I know that sexual assault is severely underreported, but there's a lot of barriers to that. There's a lot of different reasons. It's a very grueling process for a lot of people. But there's this idea that victims need to report.
Mm.
And really, as supporters, we need to give victims the options and tools so that they can make those choices. Like I said, sexual assault is about power and control. And if you're taking away their power to make choices, we're just kind of furthering that damage, right? And then the last one that I want to mention too is that healing. There's this idea that healing only looks one way, or healing is always linear, which is not always the case. We have good days, we have bad days. That doesn't mean that we're not healing and processing the trauma too. And it looks different for everyone as well. So those are just some misconceptions I wanted to go over.
Thank you for sharing that. And how you just said right now that healing does look different for everyone. Some people, they don't deal with their trauma until if it happened in their childhood, they deal with it in adulthood. Some people, it happens and they completely isolate the incident and they don't deal with it for years or never deal with it until it's brought up. Some
Mhm.
people deal with it really quickly and they report it. And, it's true what you said, trauma is different for everyone,
Yeah.
and it affects them in different ways. So, how can someone that has been, affected by sexual assault, how can that affect them mentally, emotionally, in relationships, and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a great question because as supporters, it's really important for us to understand that there are so many different ways to react to trauma. And a lot of times I hear from survivors that they're worried that they're not reacting correctly, or they aren't normal. And I like to bring up in my trainings when I talk about this that every reaction is a normal reaction to trauma. There's no correct way to react to it. And so, what I'm going to be listing now is absolutely not a complete list.
Mhm.
And also, it doesn't mean that someone's going to feel all of these things, but these are just some common reactions or impacts that we see in our clients here. And so, I have them broken down to in different categories, like you mentioned, Elizabeth. I'm going to first start with physical. So this could be, wounds such as bruising or bleeding, which is just from the sexual assault itself. It can also be, pregnancy for those who could become pregnant. It could also be contracting an STI, but also could just be physical fatigue. Maybe their body is just tired in general. And then also, like you mentioned before, that trauma can have ripple effects within relationships, people around them. I think that it's also important to highlight that these impacts and reactions can kind of feed off of each other as well. And so other stuff can be, on the mental side, it absolutely someone could be suffering from things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Another one I like to bring up is disassociation, which is essentially the feeling of an out of body experience. So a survivor during the sexual assault itself can have this out of body experience where they may not remember the clothes of the victim, or of the perpetrator, I should say, or the face of the perpetrator, but maybe they remember certain smells, or maybe they remember how many ceiling tiles are on the ceiling, that kind of thing. It's basically their brain trying to protect themselves in that moment. So that can happen then, but also later on during their healing journey, they might have these episodes where, kind of like if you're driving your car and you're going down a road and all of a sudden you're somewhere else and you don't remember kind of how you got there. That's kind of that feeling. So that's disassociation. And then going off of that, there can be severe memory loss too. So a lot of times, people who have gone through trauma might not remember exactly what happened in that moment, but later on, maybe their memories will come back. So that's very normal response to trauma. I also want to say there is this myth too, now that I'm thinking of it, that if someone didn't quote unquote fight back, that the assault didn't occur. And so when we're going through trauma, we go through that fight or flight or freeze response. I know that people are now talking about a fawn response as well. So take a look at that if you're interested. But essentially, we don't choose how we react to trauma. Our
Yeah.
body is just doing what it needs to do to survive. So if someone's freezing, they're just trying to survive in that moment. And remember coercion too. There could be a lot of different reasons why people react the way that they do, but essentially we're in no reason to judge how someone reacted to the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so just wanted to highlight that myth is definitely needs to be broken down as well. I also wanted to go back, I forgot to mention in stats too, that 8 out of 10 times survivors will actually know their perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about later on, I'll talk about like the relationship stuff, but basically it makes sense why there could be a loss of trust, especially if we knew this person. But going back to mentally, there can also be suicidality as well. And then emotionally, there could be that sense of loss or grief. Maybe they were grieving what happened, and then severe fear, of course. There could also be self-doubt or denial that the sexual assault even occurred. There can be shock or emotional numbness. So going back to that idea that there's only one way of reacting to trauma,
Mm-hmm.
that survivors will always be hysterical. Not always the case. It's very common for survivors to just feel emotionally numb or just overwhelmed in general. And then relationally, how trauma can affect a survivor. There can be, as we go through each of these, it could be one end or the other. So, for example, someone might become hypersexual, someone might become
Mm-hmm.
hyposexual. They may have fear of people who remind them of the perpetrator themselves. That loss of trust, like I mentioned, especially if this was someone that they knew, which is most often the case, but also it could be if it was a family member, right? And then also maybe withdrawing behaviors as well. Maybe they're having difficulty connecting to other people. That's
Mm-hmm.
another common reaction. And then behaviorally, I wanted to mention that there could be these behavioral, like risky behaviors. They can become hyper vigilant, or maybe they're avoiding things that remind them of the trauma. For example, if the smell of coffee reminds them of the sexual assault, maybe they're avoiding all the coffee shops on campus or something like that. It can also be eating disorders too, or other unhealthy coping mechanisms such as self-harm. And then there could be very severe different sleeping patterns too. Maybe they're sleeping a lot, or maybe they're having difficulty falling asleep too. There's a lot of different reactions to trauma. I just want everyone who is listening to know that these are all normal reactions to trauma, and that they are not alone in these reactions either.
No, that's true. And thank you for sharing those, effects, because it can affect you fully as a person in all different aspects. So, how can, let's say someone shares their story
Mhm.
of them being affected, what is someone that supports them? What's the proper way, I would say, or what's the best way maybe to respond in that? Because I feel like when people sometimes share their story or their trauma with others, sometimes we don't know how to handle that. Can you share
Yeah.
kind of from what you have experienced with your clients and victims that have experienced that, kind of the way to help them?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's one that I get a lot because there's a lot of it can be really overwhelming on how to respond to when someone does disclose that they have gone through sexual trauma or sexual assaults in the past. And first off, I just want to say that you should be really honored when someone does share this with you, because there are so many barriers that this survivor has gone through to have the courage to share it with you. And also, it shows that you're a very safe person, that they're trusting you with this information. So, first off, it just, kudos to you that someone's sharing with you, because it shows that you are that safe person for them.
Mm.
Some of those barriers I just want to mention is, I think there's a sense of shame about this topic in general. And also, they could be really afraid that no one will believe them, because we have that myth that survivors lie about being sexually assaulted, which we know is not the case. And also, they're afraid of being blamed too, because as a society, we blame the victim a lot on what happened to them. So
Mhm.
keeping that in mind as a supporter, one of the best thing that you can do, honestly, just validate their feelings and just listen to the person's story. And then other things that you can say, I believe you. That can be so impactful for a survivor, because again, they're afraid that others will not believe their story. And then you can let them know that what happened to them was not their fault, because it was not their fault. And they could be also starting to blame themselves. Oh, if I just didn't go out late. Oh, if I just didn't go upstairs. Oh, if I just didn't wear that, right? That could be going around in their mind. And so you letting them know and assuring them that what happened was not their fault can be really impactful. You can also thank them for sharing with you, and
Mhm.
letting them know that you're honored to hear it. And then you can talk, and honestly, just listening again, but also you can talk about different services that are available to them, and say, hey, I heard about the VSC, here's the helpline. And then you can help them call it. But again, none of this should be, you need to do this, you need to do that. Those are kind of controlling responses. I also want to acknowledge that as a supporter of someone too, you may want to, confront the perpetrator. You may have these feelings of anger, which those are definitely justified feelings of anger and hurt and all of that. And at the same time, we cannot do that, because it's again taking away power from the survivor, again being like, oh, I'm going to go do this, but also it could put you in danger, it could put the survivor in danger. So the best thing you can do is just be more well versed about the topic of sexual assault, be there for that person and validate their feelings. Know that you can't be their everything either. So
Mhm.
when someone does disclose to you, maybe you're their friend, you're still their friend, maybe you're their parents, you're still their parents. So continue being that person for them. um, you don't become the therapist, right?
Yeah.
And you can't do it all on your own either. So also seek support for yourself, and the VSC is here for you as well as a secondary survivor of trauma. But I hope that those tips were really helpful.
Yeah. No, I love how you touched on all those points because yeah, that's probably something as someone that hears someone's experience, you kind of want to help like you want to either take away the pain, attack the person. That's a normal reaction because you're angry, you're frustrated of someone that hurt someone that you love. But sometimes you shouldn't take it into your own hands. I think that one thing that you shared about that I was curious about is how can someone so like if someone knows a family member that did it, that did this crime, if they don't press charges and they don't find the evidence for it, does that mean that they don't get put in jail? Or like is that like a more deeper is there a more intense process for that? Because as we shared on here, most people I would say it's either in their family or someone that they know. So how would that work?
Yeah, and you know, that's a really good question. I think first off, I like to share that for the survivor themselves, going through the justice system might be the best thing for them as far as healing and closure and things like that. We always like to share when we're supporters, we like to share, and including our victim advocates and everything too, we like to share like these are the realities of reporting, not to discourage you, but just to let you know so that you have the tools necessary to make the choice that is best for you and your healing journey. So we just want to let you know that this is the process, so you are aware of it, so you know if it's the best thing for you. So that closure, that healing, doesn't always have to come from the justice system, because a lot of times it could be, you know, the person isn't found guilty, which means that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that it didn't occur. It's just maybe the evidence wasn't there, what have you. And so that's why we always say, like, start by believing, because again, that's not indicative of that survivor story. That's their story.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that, when they may not find a conviction. But two, what happens as well is that maybe the perpetrator is convicted, but it's not what the survivor was expecting. Maybe they were looking for something more too. And so healing happens outside of that too. That doesn't mean that the survivor isn't able to heal. They absolutely can. There's so many different ways to do it. And that's why seeking like counseling, seeking services like the VSC can be so, so helpful in finding community support groups, things like that can help a survivor on their healing journey as well. So I just always like to mention that. I hope that helped answer your question.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. That did. And how you said, I believe that too, that healing is much more than just it's like first believing, but also healing is like your own personal journey. And that looks
Mm,
like in your own way of figuring
yeah.
out the tools necessary for that. So there's a day coming next week that
Yeah.
I wanted you to talk about. So can you talk about Denim Day?
Yeah, so it's the perfect time to talk, and I'm really glad that you reached out to me, because it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which happens every April, and essentially it's a time to kind of uplift and honor survivor stories, bring information out about this issue, kind of promote being an active bystander, so calling out, rape jokes, maybe it's standing up for survivors in general, and just how to be an active bystander, which I'm really passionate about myself. And then, speaking of which, Denim Day, which is always the last Wednesday in April. So this year it'll be April 28th, is all about standing up to victim blaming. So Denim Day started, I think, maybe in the 90s, where in Italy, a survivor of sexual assault, she was sexually assaulted by her cab driver, and he was convicted. However, that was overturned later on, because they said that her jeans were too tight. So she must have helped take them off, and therefore they blamed her for that, for wearing too tight of jeans, which is just alarming. Every time I hear it, I get like
Mm.
chills. And so the next day, the women of the Italian parliament, actually in solidarity of the victim, to stand up to victim blaming and let them know that they believe her, they all wore denim. They all wore jeans to work. And so it became kind of a national movement in Italy, and then it became an international movement. And now everyone, every last Wednesday in April, will wear denim. And so what you can do is you can essentially, and some people wear like overalls, some people wear denim jackets, jeans. There's not just one way to do it, which is
Mhm.
very cool. But essentially you just kind of take a selfie or a picture, and you post on social media with the hashtag Denim Day. And then you can also tag us at VSC Florida as well. And essentially it's just kind of showing that you're that safe person. This is a great way to be an active bystander, because you're raising awareness to the issue of victim blaming and letting people know that you believe survivors. And also it lets survivors know, because again, now that we know all the statistics, chances are someone who has gone through this. So now they see, oh, so and so is aware of this. Great. I can reach out to them for support if I need it. They're a safe person. So that's Denim Day. And also, if you're listening and maybe on Wednesday, for work, for example, you have to wear a uniform, so you're not able to wear denim, we do have ribbons that we can send out that are made out of denim, that you can put like on your lapel or something like that too. So if you're interested, please reach out to the VSC. Victimservicecenter.org is our website, but you can just find us. Since we're the certified rape crisis center for Orange, Seminole, and Osceola County, we're pretty easy to Google. But essentially that's Denim Day. It's a really easy way to kind of bring up this information and be part of the movement.
Yeah. Yeah, you show your support, and especially with social media nowadays, like everybody's posting what they, like that's the best way to raise awareness and to talk about those things as well, with people that you know around you on posting about it. Honestly, Emily, I learned so much today with the conversation with you and just sharing all those statistics and just how that affects you, and maybe some people around you, and then how you can support those that have been through that, because how you said that most likely you probably know someone, and that's something that you have to be aware of. So what last encouragement do you have for either someone that has been through that, someone that knows someone that has been through that, or just wants to help others?
Yeah, I have a few things that I'd like to say. So, first off, if you're a supporter of someone who has gone through sexual violence, I just want to say, if someone's disclosed to you, you could have been that first person. You could have been that first person that they shared with, and so um, that you could have made a huge difference just by being there and being that supporter. So thank you. And thank you to anyone who's ever been an active bystander. It can be really scary to jump in and help. And so thank you to those that do that, who do call out rape jokes and those who trivialize rape. And then, to any survivors who are listening, you are not alone. There are so many places like the VSC that are just waiting to offer you that support, and however that looks to you. And then also, I want to mention that a lot of times I think when we talk about things like sexual violence, it can be like a daunting thing. This is definitely more of a marathon than a sprint, and there are changes that are happening. With things like the hashtag Me Too movement, there is more information. There's more people talking and speaking out against things like sexual assault, and just talking about it in general. So I just want to say that we definitely can do it. I really do believe that we can end sexual violence, just talking more about it, having podcasts like this. So thank you so much for having me on for it. Um, that's kind of the last kind of encouragement that I wanted to share with everyone.
No, thank you, Emily. And yeah, what you're doing at Victim Services is amazing, and your podcast, and just being able to have these conversations. Because I feel like even if we learn about it from a younger age, like I don't know what your target is, but I feel like if this is something that can be spoken to from, talked about, then I feel like that can help. So I agree with you. I think that that could change. So where can people connect with you? What Victim Services does? Where can they connect?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you mentioned, that podcast, so VSC Podcast, you can find that wherever you find podcasts, like on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and it's also on our YouTube channel. So, our tag for all of our social media is at VSC Florida. So, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube and Facebook. And then also, if you want to learn more about our services, you can go to victimservicecenter.org. And also, if you ever need this phone number, 407-500-HEAL, HEAL, please do not hesitate to reach out. There's always someone on the other lines ready to help.
Thank you so much. And make sure, guys, to reach out, and don't forget about Denim Day, the last Wednesday of April. We're definitely going to support. And thank you so much again, Emily. I know that you encouraged and educated someone today on this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in on today's episode. It was very educational. I learned a lot from this conversation and how you can even help others. Make sure to wear anything denim on Wednesday for Denim Day and just raise awareness. And thank you so much again. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast. If you are someone that has been affected by sexual assault or know someone, please share this episode because it can help someone else. And so thank you once again, and I will see you guys next week.